So we're talking about civility. How does this all fall apart? Well, let's take an example. What do you all see up there? Shout it out. What do you see?
A woman.
A woman's face. Is that all you see? Saxophone player. How many see a saxophone player? How many see the woman? What's really there? Both of them are there. Okay? Not a lot of passion in that unless you happen to have been a relative of the saxophone player or a relative of the blonde. Go to the next slide. Now what do you see? How do you feel about what you see? What emotions are there as part of the process? That symbol carries with it so much energy for all of us who've experienced it in one way or another. And because of that symbol, we've entered into a new level of incivility in the last couple weeks, just because of this process that we're going through. So, you heard a few of the statistics that were Nancy just mentioned. Weber Shanwick did a study about incivility in the U.S. Found 70% of Americans said that they felt incivility in the country has risen to crisis levels. 79% said incivility in government is preventing action on important issues. 77% say the U.S. is losing stature as a civil nation. Where does this take us? Well, civil discourse is on its last breath, the way things are going. And what has happened to the process as a result of this? We've had a breakdown, and we have a substantial polarization going on. In a Pew study that was done last year, and I think Nancy referred to this again, 31% of Democrats, 27% of Republicans said it would be harder to get along with a new person in their community if they happened to belong to the other party. How amazing is that? Next slide. And then, if you can't see it, the two things that are highlighted here, what Republicans and Democrats say about each other. 52% of the Republicans say Democrats are closed-minded. 70% of Democrats say Republicans are closed-minded. So much for across-the-aisle work. So Republicans and few Democratic friends are far more likely to have very cold feeling towards Democrats and vice versa. So if you don't live or have friends in the community, you're far more likely to have these problems. And where does this ultimately take us? I don't know how many of you saw this cartoon. It was in the Dispatch this past few days. And let me read it for you. What say you, dear Juliet, that our love shall never be? 'Cause you watch Rachel Maddow while I get news from Hannity. So think about your own families. Think about your friends. What has happened to the level of civility in this country today? What it used to be is that if you felt anger towards a particular candidate or a particular office holder, you held that anger towards that person. But what's happened now is we've all internalized that and now take it out on supporters of that person. So within our families, we have problems. Within our friendships, within our church, we have problems. So where does this take us from the National Institute of Civil Discourse? Nancy was kind enough, why don't you go ahead and do the next screen, kind enough to describe what was the foundation of the National Institute. The unfortunate shooting of Gabby Giffords in 2011, when she was going to have a town meeting. Several people were killed. She was seriously injured. Folks in Tucson wanted to do something about it, make something positive come out of that tragedy, and so they set up NICD, the National Institute for Civil Discourse, designed to enable elected officials, the media, in the public to impact change in the systems in which they participate. A piece of that institute was created by me in 1 year after the NICD was put together, when I approached them and said their focus on elected officials had been in Washington, where most of us saw that incivility going on. And so I said, if you think about where people come from who end up in Congress, it's from state houses. Over 50% of folks who end up in Congress come from state houses. So we put together a program, it's called Next Generation, that focuses, it's put together by state legislators, for state legislators. We've trained 40 legislators to be facilitators for the workshop. And the results of that have generated, you can see the orange states are ones where we've already had, it's a half-day workshop. The yellow ones are ones that are pending. And we've had lots of interest from additional states as part of the process. The name of the workshop is Building Trust Through Civil Discourse. It is, as I said, a half-day workshop, and the important piece of this is that it is important that we provide a safe place for these legislators to share their ideas. And part of the process is training facilitators to kind of move back from, since they're legislators, move back from the role of having to have all the answers, to take a role and say, how do we get you as a group to talk about what's going on in your states and how you'd like to make a difference, and tell us a little bit about who you really are as well. So Building Trust Through Civil Discourse is a half-day workshop that we've had 22 workshops in 15 states so far.
Well, a friend of mine passed away, and she was all about reconciliation, always about reaching out to people, and to unlikely people. When she passed away, I wanted to do something to honor her. And I thought, who would be the most unlikely person on the planet that I would reach out to? And it was Bob.
I'm the president and CEO of the Family Leader, and our mission statement is to strengthen families by inspiring Christ-like leadership in the home, the church, and government.
I'm the executive director at One Iowa, which is the state's largest lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender organization. I've been an activist and an advocate and sometimes an agitator in this movement for almost 30 years.
Well, Donna and I, we see the world very differently. In our view on marriage, on sexuality, and probably on a lot of other issues.
I guess you'd have to say that my impression of Bob was not only he was the opposition, he was the enemy.
I've probably made statements about her and her organization in the press. She's probably made statements about me and my organization in the press. We weren't natural allies. We weren't natural coffee buddies. And so she emailed the Family Leader and said, hey, I talked to Bob, and Bob said he'd be willing to do coffee. Let me know a good time and date. And so they shared that email with me like, is this true? I mean, is this real? And I said, yeah, it's real, but I never thought she'd follow up on it.
I never thought that he would respond.
And so we set a date to have coffee.
And that was the beginning of this amazing journey. I remember walking in just being very nervous. I had no idea what to expect, none at all.
Well, you know, the skeptic in me thought she would have an agenda, and she probably thought I might have an agenda. But as soon as we sat down, I thought, she doesn't have an agenda. She just wants to get to know who I am. And that really compelled me to say, I should want to get to know who she is.
I think when people have the courage to show you who they are, something happens. And so what surprised me about Bob was his humanity. He's an incredible dad. I also found him to be really funny, and I didn't expect that at all. But we laugh a lot.
Donna's a very good person. She's a passionate person. She has advocated for her issues tirelessly for over 3 decades. So regardless if I agree or disagree with her on the issues, I have a tremendous respect for her.
For a long time, I've been really tired of the hate and the aggression and the kind of snarkiness. We can disagree without being disagreeable. We can fight the good fight in the court of public opinion, but we don't have to hurt each other. That's, I think, the big takeaway for me. We don't have to hurt each other, because when we do that, we're hurting ourselves. We get coffee about once every couple of months.
And I think with Donna, her and I readily assessed that we have a lot of common interest. We have some common ground. The only regret in all of that is that I wasn't the one to ask her out for coffee. And she's the one who asked me out. And I'm glad she did, but I kind of feel like I should have.
What surprised me was not that he liked me. I thought, yeah, he'd like me. What surprised me was I really liked him.
It hasn't changed my beliefs. It may have changed my approach, because when we do put out a press release, when we do make a public statement, many times I think, I wonder how Donna will view this.
Here's the deal. If Bob and I can have coffee, if we can tell stories and laugh and get to know each other, if we can like each other, then I think almost anyone can find that person in their life, and maybe they can reach out their hand and invite them in.
That's Donna, who is the head of the LGBT community, state community in Iowa. And the voice you heard, Bob, is the head of the Family Christian Council in Iowa. The two of them, at Donna's request, got together to sit down and see if they had any commonality. And this little vignette describes that process for each of them. And what Donna says that really is important to what we do is when you have the courage to tell people who you really are, good things happen. And what Bob says, as a result of this exercise, we didn't change our opinions about the issues which we disagree on, but what we did determine is that we didn't have to degrade each other. So he said when he now prepares a press release, he thinks, what would Donna say before he writes that press release? Tremendous impact, and it's really the involvement of that kind of getting together. And so we encourage people to have coffee or lunch with an unlikely friend. So someone in your family, someone in your church. If you've not had the occasion to really be able to talk to them because of the differences, this is something we would encourage. So go to the next slide. So that introduces the subject. I mentioned the importance of establishing a safe place, so we need to do some ground rules. Ground rules are really important. Ground rules are the kind of conversation you want to have. If we're going to be feeling like we want to share personal stuff, we want to know that you'll be listening to what we're saying and not forming an opinion. We hope you'll really be involved and as part of the process. Each of the groups set up their own ground rules, very important part. Personal journey, very impactful part. It is a request of everyone participating to think about the event or person in their life that had the most profound impact on who they are personally today. What event or person in their life helped form where they have their personal values today? This is an experience that many of these folks have not undertaken. It takes them to a place that they haven't been for a long time. And when they share that, it also creates an environment where people begin to trust and are prepared to share. So as a result of the personal journey, we go on to talk about the present level of civility in their states, how could they increase it, come up with some specific action steps. Next slide. So what kind of impacts have we had? Number one is institutionalization. In one state, in Maine, they've had 4 workshops. The Maine Development Foundation is now encouraging the every new class to come through this workshop as part of their orientation program. A couple other states are doing that as well. Increased bipartisan interaction, legislation which is co-sponsored by Democrats and Republicans. Legislative process improved in Oregon, for instance. The Senate, instead of sitting Republicans on one side, Democrats on the other, they sit alphabetically, so they're mixed and they get a chance to interact with each other all the time. They also have a situation there where they have some of the minority party as committee chairman. Interestingly enough, the President of the Senate had to hear it from his own caucus because he let people from the other party be chairman. But, you know, it works. And finally, a very important product of this is the creation of the National Network of State Legislators who are committed to civil governance. And this group of 100 legislators from 30 states, go to the next slide. Here's some of them at the kickoff in Seattle a couple years ago. Gabby Gifford's there in the middle. Helps meet on a regular basis. They share best practices. They talk about things that are working. We've worked with a number of the legislatures to create civility resolutions, which have been introduced in their legislatures, and we have a very active group. Actually, you can probably see there's 3 or 4 Ohio representatives in there as well. Fred Strayhorn, Denise Driehaus, Nikki Antonio. We have, as I said, 40 trained legislators who are part of our facilitation crew, and we have as many Democrats as Republicans, and we try to have each one done on a bipartisan basis. The one thing I'd say about where we are now is that we've seen the importance of having leadership take the initiative on this, and so in the state of Idaho, the Speaker and the President of the Senate invited us in to do a program for leadership. They tried it out. They said, this is really something our legislators need. So they invited us back to do the whole legislature. We met with 104, actually one was absent, 104 legislators who went through the process. And the President of the Senate is now one of our biggest advocates and has talked about what a change it has made. One of several of his people in the Senate and the House became members of our facilitation crew as a result of the process. As a result of that effort, we've now, this past month and next week, we'll be meeting with leadership in a variety of settings. Met in Cape Cod with a Republican and Democratic leader from 12 states, so 23 legislators. We met with 30 majority leaders in Denver. And next week, I'm presenting to 30 speakers of the House from 30 states who will be here in Ohio. We're hosting it in Ohio to talk about the importance of civility. So beyond the effort that we're doing, what's happened at the Institute is we've created a Revive Civility, Our Democracy Depends on It national campaign. And that's really how we got into the discussion about what could be done here. We're trying to bring a network of networks, elected officials, faith leaders, researchers, community leaders, and journalists to the process to really deal with the situation that we presently have. Next slide. And it starts with each of us. And how does it start? You can join the campaign by signing onto the standards of conduct. You can go on to the and pledge, take the Civility Pledge on our website, and we'd be happy to get you that information. And a number of cities, including Columbus and Arlington, have done proclamations. This one was done in Tucson in April, making May, I believe it was, the Civility Month. And then there's this program called Text Talk Revive Civility. And this is a way for you and 3 or 4 or 5 of your friends to get together and have a kind of discussion. And actually, if you did that, you'd be able to see the video I just told you about. So it's a way to see it and have access to it. All you do is text the word civility to 89800. And on the next screen, you'll see how to do that. 89800, just text the word civility, and you'll be able to see that. So that's one way, and we really use it as a way for young people in particular, since they're used to texting. We also have developed some paper-based discussion guides and some additional tools for getting people engaged. And as you consider what you might do as a club relative to this, there's a number of things that, and tools that we could help provide if you want to consider it. So where are we? Well, instead of an age of enlightenment, we are in an age of snarky individualism and incivility. Our environment shapes the behavior. There is a need for opportunities that embrace commonalities and venues that require us to listen to the other side. So, for all of you considering what can I do, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Our friend Margaret Mead wrote that. And thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Has your group thought about issuing a joint challenge to the major broadcast networks to conduct workshops and demonstrate civility on the same stage at the same time?
That's a really good question, and I mentioned that the media and journalism is a big piece of what we do. We held a national conference with journalists 2 years ago. Last year we focused on one here in Ohio to try to get folks to determine. The news media met with members of the public and members of elected officials to share ideas about each other, and the news media heard some things they didn't really like. We don't trust you, you don't tell the truth, and it opened some eyes. And so last year they tried a program that worked pretty well, but they were convinced they needed a lot more work to do. And so this year in the state of Ohio, led by Opplinger, formerly of the Akron Beacon Journal, they're doing a statewide 26, 28 media outlets involved in the process and in their engagement, and how do we deal with just what you're talking about. Yes?
Do you notice any difference in a unicameral legislature where all the legislators are in one body?
That's an interesting question. We did go to do our program in Nebraska. His question was, did we notice any difference in a unicameral legislature where they're all just one body? And Nebraska is the only place where that is. They have a Senate. And interestingly enough, it's not only unicameral, it's quote-unquote nonpartisan. Everybody knows who the Republicans are, who the Democrats are anyway, but their problems are different, interestingly enough, because we hear in other states that it's the caucuses, the Republican caucus, the Democratic caucus, that present the problems. In Nebraska, what they said was, we'd love to have a caucus because we never get together to discuss what is important to those of us who have common ideas. So. But there is a unique situation in Nebraska, and I don't know what's actually happened for other states to consider that, but it is a unique situation.
Yes.
Over the last 20 years, it seems like Republicans are way out on one side and Democrats are way out on another side. The extremes seem to get elected. We had a speaker within the last couple of years come in and talk about voting districts and zonings and all that. Is pretty bizarre, to say the least. Can you give your thoughts on solving the core problem of getting the extremities out of the extremeness out of the political parties?
Sure.
There's one of the facilitators is from Ohio, Frank LaRose. He's a Republican senator from Akron. And he and I introduced legislation on redistricting together back when I was in the House, with the idea of having it taken out of the political process and having an independent group put that together. I think that's the only way that's going to happen. There's a petition going on now to have that happen. I think that it's Without that, you're going to continue to have the same problems. Who's ever in charge is going to write those districts so they stay in charge. And so that's where all the money gets spent, and we're about to see it because those new districts will be done each centennial, so 2010 or 2020 will be the next redistricting effort. And so for the next 3 years, there's going to be a lot of money spent on how do we get control of those legislators to draw those lines.
Ted, really important stuff you're doing. The question about the younger generation, millennials and so forth, and their role in engaging that whole group, the younger group, in the political process. Do you see that changing, or do you see, what are your thoughts about that?
Boy, that's a softball question for wonderful teachers of young folks who've tried to undertake a mission to deal with this. So Terry's son has been involved in a program to add civic education, civility into the process, and we've at that Text Talk Revive Civility program is really aimed at two populations, younger people, where we've actually had it introduced as part of curriculum, and also for adults. But it was used very effectively in another program where we were dealing with mental health issues, and it was used to get young people to talk about bullying and suicide prevention, and they got very engaged in the process as a result of it. So it's using the tools that they are used to. Scott.
One more. Could you comment on the effect of term limits on civility in the legislatures?
It looks like that was a common question. I think you had the question was going to come from behind you as well. Absolutely. The question was the impact of term limits on the quality of civility, and in every state that has term limits, every group of legislators has raised that as one of the problems, that there's no institutional memory as a result of term limits, that unfortunately they have to depend on others, the professionals who have an interest in the legislation that's going on in their states, and so it changes dramatically. And the people who support the idea of term limits really have not provided the response to the program of or to the suggestion that it eliminates this need for institutional memory. Is that the last question, or was I? One more. Yes.
Yes. Could you comment on the impact of fake news on civility?
Impact of fake news on civility. The difficulty with that question is, what's real anymore? I mean, the fact that so many different people online can feed information and you don't know what the source is, what the reality is, so we're all forced to go to places that we trust for information, and are those sources all giving us good news? And I think the impact of fake news has had a tremendous, or the concept of fake news has had a tremendous impact, particularly recently when it's been kind of beaten into us regularly that everything is fake news and that you can't trust them. The only thing I'd say is the danger of fake news to incivility is where it's headed by our president saying that you can't trust journalists and that the journalists don't love this country, and goes beyond. And it gets to a point that it's rousing people to have these hostile feelings toward people who are trying to do a job. And I'd say that's potentially, if it keeps going, the biggest problem. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Ted. I think we would all agree that civility grows where people know each other, like at a Rotary meeting. Thank you very much for coming.